what we do a lot with success is externalize it, meaning, right, it's whether we're looking at competitive, it's the time I want to hit, or it's the game I want to win, but also in life, it's the amount of money I want to make, it's the status I want, it's the title I want, it's the whatever, it's the client I want to land, could be anything. But what we fail to pay attention to in that sort of equation is the internal part. And so whether you want to call that the joy of doing that thing, or the process, or the mental peace that you have at any point in that game, I think for me, that's a far more relevant measure of success than what that looks like on the outside. So really, it's that shift from what does it look like outside versus what does it actually feel like inside. And I think that's the only thing that actually can determine success. And it's just a little harder to measure and a little harder to define, which is why a lot of people just don't do it. But it's also infinitely more fulfilling to look at it that way.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is that so often people define success by the tangible things, the medal, the car, the appearance of of wealth. But what I'm hearing you say, it's actually the intangible things that are the internal. I'm curious, when you started down the line of psychology, like what made you want to make the jump? Because I find it really interesting. You're like, hey, no, the success is actually defined from these internal, if you want to see, talk about like key performance indicators, right? But are more internal, that most people aren't maybe measuring or even aware of or able to actually quantify. But what about the psychology background made you go, hey, the people I want to help most are entrepreneurs?
Really great question. I will preface it by saying that even with the psychology background, I was always more interested in the, let's say, enhancing side of psychology. So what I mean by that is most people think clinical psychology. So, somebody's mentally ill, how do we get them to feel good again? And there's a whole other side of psychology. Sometimes we think about it with like sports psychology, that is motivational psychology, that is positive psychology, that is enhancing, like I'm doing all right, but how do I do great? And whether that's applied to teams, or whether that's applied to sports, or whether that's applied to an individual, I was always more in that space. So sort of we're at 0, it's fine, but how do we get to +5? Versus, let's say, simplified clinical psychology being more in like, I'm doing poorly, I'm at -5, how do I get back to 0? So that's an important distinction to make in terms of like the psychology background. It was always in this like enhancing sort of space. And then I was working a lot with just leaders and people who like on their careers. So it was always kind of applied to, let's say, the workspace. Honestly, until a few things happened, but until I eventually started my own business and just met a lot more entrepreneurial minds traveling and like living my life, which I'm sure we'll get into, and just feeling like that resonated with me a lot more, like this whole idea of taking life into your own hands is kind of what entrepreneurship kind of symbolizes for me. It's like I'm doing my own thing in its, very nature, whatever that looks like. And I just found that naturally I gravitated more towards those conversations and I found them more interesting. And then as I built my own business, it's also who I naturally attracted more of. So it was a bit of a more like natural development towards just interest within the scope of like performance enhancing, let's say, psychology.
Oftentimes I find that the thing that we bring out into the world are the things that we actually looked and or looking to actually create for ourselves. I'm really curious, from your background and your journey through life, these internal metrics, these internal core structures, how has your lived life put you in a position for you to be able to, I think, speak like at an expert level about these internal success pieces?
Do you know my actual intuitive response to that is like, I don't know if I'm equipped to speak at that an expert level, right? I can only speak at the level that I am at and from the experience that I have. And whether that's expert or not, I can't say. But I think that I've had enough contact, and probably not nearly as much as a lot of other people, with, I want to say, the traditional scopes of success and functioning in a society that is very outward driven. So I'm from Switzerland, as you mentioned, and I love Switzerland. It's a beautiful place. And also, I think we all know it's, everything functions and everything works a certain way and everything is punctual and everything is driven for optimization in a certain way, which is wonderful. I was just telling a friend the other day, when I had to get my passport renewed in Switzerland, it took me like literally all of 2 minutes because it's just so perfectly optimized and systematized. So that's like an example of how that society works. And I was functioning really well in that, but it just felt like I can't describe it any further than just, it just felt like this kind of like dullness is probably the best way. It wasn't like a gaping hole. It wasn't like, oh, I'm so sad or unhappy or anything like that. It was just a dullness. And there's a term in psychology that we call languishing, which is kind of if you're existing at that space where everything just feels like kind of fine, but you're not like thriving and you're not like really excited about anything, but you're also not upset about anything. It's just kind of this like middle space. And that's probably what it felt like the most. And then I was like, well, there's got to be something else. And you combine that with also what I learned in psychology, but then applying that. And that took me on a journey of like travel and completely reinventing what I thought it meant to, I think, live appropriately, whatever that means. I think travel does that for you, where it allows you to completely just see that the rules are all made up. Like you don't need to do very much but visit a culture that is completely different from yours to see that the rules are made up and there's a completely different way to live. And so I think I exposed myself to a lot of that. And then from there, built my own structure for like, well, what are my values around this? What are my core beliefs around like what makes me feel happy and fulfilled and at peace, and also sets me up for the future without like being I want to say, I think whenever I mention this, I feel like people go like, well, but that's reckless. Like you got to think about the future and you got to think about your responsibilities and all these things. And it's like, there's a middle ground where you can design your life in a way that allows you to do that and also enjoy literally everyday life and the process of doing it versus I'm just going to strive until I hit a certain income status, retirement, whatever it is.
I'm really curious in this idea of languishing because I think that so many people, they just expect that like, well, this is what life is. It's like, and I think I heard I think this guy named Eric Dickerson on podcast Diary of a CEO. I think I got his last name correctly, where he basically talked about we are a collection of basically of all of these large language models. Like we are large language models, right? These external narratives that have been reinforced by thousands of data points, right? Whether they're micro expressions or micro sort of like tears, right, that happen in life, and it's these external expectations. What about it for you that you were like, hey, I'm feeling dull, and this is what I'm going to need, right? Because I'm thinking about even as entrepreneurs, and you see it all the time with elite, either athletes or entrepreneurs or growth-minded human beings, that they just get to a point where even though when they look around them externally, they're like winning, 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 winning. Even potentially even in their relationships, they're like, they have the incredible family life, but they still feel like they're languishing. What was it about that you said, this is actually the prescription I need to break me out of that languishing? And I think the following question, what have you noticed with entrepreneurs or even growth-minded individuals that help them beat that languishing feeling?
I'll try and answer the first part, which is probably a lot less systematic than maybe the question was looking for, but I don't think that I ever set out to like prescribe myself a formula, right? It was more like finding my way into the formula than it was me being like, okay, I'm languishing, so I need to change X, Y, and Z to do that. I didn't even have the language, even with my background. I didn't have the languishing actually got really popular in the pandemic, where I think it was Adam Grant who wrote a like New York Times article on it. And then it just like, since then it's become this whole like better studied concept. It existed before then, but that's kind of when it became popularized. And I don't think I realized that that was what was happening when I was feeling that way. And it was much more an intuitive, like curiosity following that when I look back now with hindsight bias, I can be like, oh, okay, here are the things that like made that feel better for me. When I think about my own journey, but then also when I think about other people that I work with, I think the shift is often sort of from the pursuit into the present. And so when you say growth minded and like high achievers and right, like we're often so conditioned and so used to striving for something and achieving something and consistently achieving, right? What we also do is consistently move the goalpost and that we have something else to strive for. And there's so much joy that we can get from the pursuit. But if that's not balanced out with everything that's already in the present and learning how to appreciate and sort of live there without the pursuit, then I think you are going to be in a space of languishing, because all you're doing is you're giving yourself a period of time where you're striving towards something, but then you hit it. And then it gives you a brief moment, but then it falls off again. And you're like, why am I not getting the satisfaction that I wanted to get from all these things that I've achieved? But it's actually not about achieving anymore. It's that you need to make a mental shift around away from that and about defining your life in a much broader way, in a much broader sense around presence versus around getting somewhere or achieving something.
Let's pretend I'm an entrepreneur coming to you, and it's clear when you say, tell me about your life, right? And I spin this incredible tale, which anyone else would go. And again, one of the reasons why I launched MaxLife podcast is that this idea of that there's a intersection between the success that everyone maybe sees externally and the life that's actually lived. And I think this is like the natural outcomes of the energy that you're driving. What are the questions that you find really helpful to help someone be able to kind of recapture that energy, like recapture that pulse, that basically that underground, like artisanal stream of the word that keeps coming to my head is gratitude. Like we're trying to re-tap back into that gratitude. What would you be asking me, or what should an entrepreneur who's listening to this, or someone who's even in that space, what should they be asking?
I mean, okay. Love the question. And I could go a million sort of different directions, because especially since you mentioned the gratitude stream. But I think the more interesting and also the broader question that anyone can ask themselves, and you're going to laugh because it's a simple question, but it's not simple to answer, is what do I want? And it's like such a simple question, but hear me out. Most people will go like, well, I want more money and I want this and I want this. And you start at a top layer. And then you go, okay, and what else? And what else? And what else? And what else? Sort of like at least 5 times, because what typically tends to happen is you start at the broader outside layer. And then when you're forced to think beyond that, you're like, well, actually, all I want is like to have time with my kids and like sort of wake up happy and be healthy when I'm 70 and whatever. You deepen the layer of like what you want. Because the thing about what you want is that no matter what it is, you're usually wanting what you think that will facilitate in terms of an experience. So you usually don't want the outcome, you want a feeling that you expect the outcome to bring. So if I'm saying I want more money, it's not about the money, it's about what I think the money will facilitate, right? And that could be a feeling of security, sure. But how do I notice that? What does that mean in my everyday life, right? Does that mean I have more time with my kids? Does that mean I don't know, I can buy other things. Don't have to worry about buying groceries, whatever it is, right? But it has an impact that is felt much more than it is on that level. And so if you get curious enough about this question to move from that outer layer to what experience, what feeling am I actually trying to facilitate, you get to the core of it. And when you get to the core of it, you can also find ways of like, wait, in what ways is that already here? Like, in what ways am I actually keeping myself from, let's go with the example, spending time with my kids, because I am so hell-bent on striving towards whatever the next income goal. And what if I don't have to do that? Actually, if I stayed at the same income goal, but I could take X amount more time with my kids instead, would that not actually make me more successful if I look at it from that measure? So it's a very simple question, but most people stop at that first layer, which is how you end up with the external goals, right? It's exactly how you end up with all the, I want to make more money, I want to drive this car, I want to whatever, versus the deeper layers. But you got to stay persistent with that question. And it's often with a coaching conversation that you get to have somebody mirror back and say like, here's what I heard. And what does that mean for you? What is that facilitating for you?
By the way, I found that any one time someone says simple, I think that people misinterpret simple as easy. In fact, anytime someone says simple, I just go, uh-oh, this is going to be hard. Because simple is in essence the excavation of all the bullshit and really getting down to like, what is the simple ingredients to make this like incredible dish. I mean, all the best meals I've ever had have actually less ingredients, not more. Right. But it's like the preparation, the technique, and the awareness about how do you actually layer them, put them on the plate. And I think that so often that the life that we're trying to create for ourselves is like the dish that we would want to literally start with our eyes, right? Then our nose, right? And then we actually put it in our mouth, right? And then it's like the mouth feel, and you just go, man. But sorry, I almost got lost down like this food analogy here. But I'm really curious. I think that so often we tell ourselves lies, and lies, like in terms of whether it's the programming, or it's the justification, or the shame avoidance or judgment avoidance. But in that simple question, because I'm thinking about beliefs, identities, what are the lies that you see kind of get in the way of that simplicity?
First of all, I love that analogy. I think you could have gone down that rabbit hole further because we could think about the simple ingredients for a well-lived life, right? And actually, I think in many ways, we're all much more similar than we uh, maybe think ourselves to be. We're actually all very simple in that way, as in because we're just human beings and we have basic needs and simple wants. And actually, if we have those, then we're generally pretty content. So in that way, it's a great question to explore. What are those basic ingredients? If we're looking at the dish of life, let's say, right? But I think you're right in terms of telling ourselves a lot of lies, and that's very layered. Also, where those lies come from, like a lot of the things that we tell ourselves as lies are probably things that we never thought that were never our own original thoughts, but they were conditioning, right? It's something that I grew up learning. It's that this is the like easiest example, like work hard for better results, or success means, you kind of got to hustle for what you want, or the American dream even, right? Like, and that's not to say those things can't work. It's not to say those things don't exist. It's to say that you have a choice to make on whether that's the only rule you subscribe to, and that's the only way you believe this can happen. When for all of those, I can think of multiple examples where that's not true, right? And so there's a lot of these things where we just accept something as the bare truth when really all it is conditioning and perception. And that's where it becomes a lie, when we never question it. When we just go like, well, no, I have to work longer and harder. It's the only way I'll be successful. And you've never stopped to ask what success even is for you, right? If success is more time with your kids, you're doing the wrong thing, for example. Or you think that there's only a certain way to prepare for the future, or to show up even in relationships, whatever it is. There's a lot of unwritten rules that are different by culture, different by upbringing. So if my parents believed a certain something, for example, I come from a household, I love my parents to death. They did a wonderful job. I'm very happy. Like, this is the thing where I always like, whenever I speak about my parents, I'm like, I phrase it and like, I put it in the context of like, I think they did a wonderful job. I had a really wonderful childhood. And also, I think it's not possible for any parent to like get through unscathed, in the sense of like, there's going to be something that your child in the end says like, that was not okay. Or like, we could have done that better. So they were the kind of household where it's like, if I brought home, in Switzerland, the grading system is 1 to 6. So if you have to imagine six is essentially often not given in the Swiss grading system, in the school system, but they work in like 0.5. So meaning 5.5 is a very good, it's an A. And like it's 6 is exceptional, right? So A plus, if like whatever. And so like I would bring home like these grades, and I have like the 5.5, which like I was the only one in my class to get the 5.5 sometimes or whatever. And like my parents' response, bless them, would be like, what was missing for a 6? Why not a 6? Like as if the goal was always like to maximize everything always, all the time, rather than seeing the accomplishment in that, but B, also seeing the breadth across, right? Like if any one subject I got a 6, great, but it's probably actually generally making me a more educated person if I have somewhere in a range of good across the field, if that makes sense. And so it was just, I don't know how I got here. That was an example of, sorry, an example of, like just an expectation that I took on in my childhood, where it was like, it's only really good, and I'm only really like doing my best if it's like, if I achieved 100%. And this is something I work with a lot of people who have, a lot of high achievers have perfectionist tendencies, where it can become a real barrier because, again, this is now when we can go into identity and whatever it is, but you kind of build an idea around, well, I'm the smart one and I'm the one that gets 100%. And then once I put myself in a position where I fear I might not get that, then I can really paralyze myself. And especially in entrepreneurship, there are so many unknowns and so many risks you're taking on a daily basis, whether that's a risk in the way you express an idea, or a financial risk where there is no such thing. And so you paralyze yourself because you think there's a way that you can reach that point. So I kind of got off track there, but like the lies are very, very layered. The lies are, it's not as easy as like giving somebody a list of lies and being like, which one applies to you? Because it'll depend so much on what your culture is, what your upbringing is, right? And sort of what you consume, even. Like we could talk about lies in terms of movies, you know, the lie of Disney's Happy Ever After is also not everyday life in terms of building a relationship where it requires you to have difficult conversations and like, you know, be together within the happily ever after rather than just sail together into the sunset. So there's so many layers to this, and I think it's much more around the curiosity around it and the questioning. That's where your power lies. Like there's plenty of lies I'm sure I'm still telling myself. It's much more about the discovery process and the, you know, like, oh, what else could be true, that I kind of ask myself on a recurring basis when I find myself feeling like there's only one option.
Well, I find everything you said there incredibly fascinating. Especially, I'm really curious that you talked about the education system. I dropped out of college halfway through my junior year, actually halfway through my second semester of junior year. And it took me, the lie that I told myself for probably a decade was that when people would say, well, where did you go to school? That my value was actually not in terms of the thing that I was curating, the value that was how I saw the world and how it could be for them was not the thing that they valued. It was actually in terms of, well, what makes you qualified to talk about it? And it took me about a decade to really shed that. Just really, it was almost like a cataract over my eyes that I felt so much like shame and judgment around because like I had not finished, you know, this thing that so many people hold dear. And again, people who finished their degree, awesome, right? And that's not to say like, but it was a big lie that honestly sucked so much when I look back during that 10 years, so much creativity, so much gratitude, so much just like being where my feet needed to be at. And I'm realizing that in kind of going to these core ingredients you're talking about, this simplicity. You know, I was telling you beforehand, and again, people who've listened to the podcast know the story about my son and the 16 days that he was alive. And I've realized that I think that what what for me that I crave is these experiences that make me feel like I'm living. And you know, even though in terms of would I love my son to still be here? Yes, 100%. But I look at those 16 days and going, I've never been more present in my life. Those 16 days was a level of presence that literally I'm still searching for. Like the day that he died and after we pulled the breathing tube, the amount of it transcended anything I could even like talk about or even explain because the level of peace, I thought I was just going to be just on the ground uncontrollably sobbing, which I was leading up to like as we were pulling out the breathing tube. But afterwards, there was a level of peace where I'm just going like I'm still searching to have that experience again because it was so and I'm finding so much more that these external sort of outcomes or like the avoidance of hard things is the lie that we tell ourselves that like it should be easy, it should be, you know, no, you know, but at the same time we have this idea of no pain no gain, and I think there's like there's both, there's that truth and this truth, and then the truth actually lies somewhere in between, and I find that it's like the messy middle is actually the umami. Like going back to cooking, it's like, you know, it's like sweet, sour, bitter. Um, I can't remember the other one. Maybe it's like savory, but like that we can actually taste. But there's this idea of the thing that we can't really articulate. We just call that umami. And I feel like that's the part that in between. And I feel like it's this pendulum. And I'm curious from your perspective, it's like this pendulum. Like we go from perfectionism to like, oh, hey, my life's like a mess. And it's like when we hit that like sweet spot. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that you just made a really, really important point. And I think that when we think about the lies or the rules or whatever we want to call it, the conditioning, it often exists in the extremes, right? Like, so we have a spectrum. You're absolutely right. There's 100% a spectrum to all of this. And the lies either, you know, everything should be easy and flow and effortless kind of thing, or, no pain, no gain, like work hard, grind, 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 where the truth is very much in the middle. Like I'm a big believer in facing discomfort to, get to new places. And also I'm very much not an advocate for like work as hard as you can and grind, grind, grind away, because I actually think that's very unsustainable when we look at it from a brain perspective and from a mental health perspective and all these things. But I think the interesting thing about that spectrum is that it is just so much easier, and you'll notice this in everyday life with yourself and in conversations. It is so much easier to exist and to talk about a binary, right? Like our brain loves the simplicity of that. It's a very, like, it doesn't matter if we just talk about it in like everyday terms or in psychological terms. Like it's a well-known sort of thinking trap to be in this all or nothing thinking or in the black or white thinking. And that's essentially like that on steroids, right? Like where it's this or that. And whenever I think there's only two options, I'm almost always wrong. And it's time to look at the gray zone in the middle, right? Like the messy middle, as you called it. I also have spoken about the messy middle every once in a while. And that's actually where it lies. But that's so much harder to categorize that it's just, you won't get there unless you're actively questioning and thinking about what you actually want that to mean. Because the simple message that is work hard and then, gain lots, or actually, if you're doing it right, it doesn't feel like work at all. Sort of like if you do what you love, you won't work a day in your life, right? Is maybe the opposite side of that. They're so much easier to digest and so much easier for your brain to hold on to and to categorize and to store away than to be like, well, hang on. There's probably nuance to this. There's probably like a lot of different truths to that somewhere along that spectrum. And my truth with how I want my work to be or what suits my energy and my talents and whatever it is probably completely somewhere in the middle. And as long as I'm still existing on one side of the extreme, whichever one it is really, I'm probably in a lie, because the lie assumes there's this way or no way, right? Like, and even when you mentioned just perfectionists, right? Like then when I speak to perfectionism, first of all, they often kind of mask, I want to say high standards. I just have really high standards. I just strive for excellence. That's not the same. It's not the same. If you're striving for high standards and excellence, you have to iterate. You literally cannot produce something excellent in isolation. It can't happen. You have to go out and you have to give it to the people who it's supposed to serve, and then they give you feedback, and that way it becomes better, and that way it can eventually become excellent. If you're in a perfectionist mindset or state, you're typically avoiding exactly that, because you think that if you just make it better and better and better and better and better, aka perfect first, then people are going to love it either way. That's not how it works. But that's a sidetrack. Often when I speak to them about, kind of reassessing how they determine, let's say, the high standard, they immediately go, well, but then I won't achieve anything in life. And like they immediately, their image in their mind immediately goes to like, I will become a complete and utter couch potato who like never does anything, never exercises, doesn't achieve anything in their life. And like, I don't know, lives off of social benefits or something like that. And it's like, do you see like you've just taken yourself from one extreme where like I wake up at 5 a.m., I have the perfect workout routine, I strive for all these things, I have all these goals and achieve all these things, to the like, what? Like, what do you mean? What, like, for that to go to that, so much has to happen. You have to go around so many corners, and you won't go there because that's not your personality. You just won't go there. But if you want to have a little more happiness and a little more joy and presence in your life, you're going to have to move on that spectrum. That doesn't have to take you to a couch potato, but it takes you to a more regulated state, which then actually enables you to do more excellent things and more high standard things versus just the grind, grind, grind kind of perfectionist way.
The thing I keep thinking in my brain, that I keep visualizing as I'm listening to Charlotte, is that we talked about these simple ingredients. And I think that the more and more that I'm around entrepreneurs and coaching entrepreneurs and having conversations with incredibly smart people like you, is that I feel like at the end of the day, we are all just looking to be seen, heard, understood, and I think in that feeling just a sense of feeling loved. Because I think when those things happen, you feel it's like even as I say it, I'm just imagining like this hug. And um the more I spend in this like world and listening to conversations like this with you, is that I'm realizing that we try to humanize all these things with all these different words and all these different sort of like, even strategizing, right? Talking about these spectrums, right, that we're on. But then the day we're all just trying to find this healthy balance of this like energy. And it's like, and we find this, if you, there's like a little sweet spot, almost like a bell curve, right? But it's like instead of it's 68%, it's sort of like there's a bell curve that's like about 5-10% wide. And then there's these spectrums on either side that like we vastly swing through. And occasionally we're like, man, it's these moments where we often seen in Hollywood where we romanticize. And it's like, I've heard people like Dan Martell call it like in the pocket moments. Like I think of like in a sunrise or a sunset where you're going, this is it. Like this is it. And and I've realized that I feel like that there's these batteries, there's energy. Like we're walking this treadmill called life, and that our past is like a battery that if we don't appropriately have charged, right, we can't pull from. And then our future dreams are like the future battery that we can pull back into here. But I'm curious of how you define happiness and joy. And I'll give the context why I'm asking is I feel that people pursue happiness, but it's such a transaction versus joy being like a transformation. And I know that maybe you layer enough happy things that helps you transform to joy, but like how do you correlate those two and how do you define those two and what's the balance between the that realignment of energy to just joy versus like happiness and maybe they're not binary.
First of all, please tell me more about the distinction between happiness and joy in your mind, because that sounded really interesting to me, and I just want to wrap my head around it.
So I remember this guy, I think his name was Jamie Clark. I was listening to him talk. He had climbed Mount Everest and he was doing his speaking tour, right? To monetize, like, hey, did this really incredible physical feat. I mean, most everyone's heard of Mount Everest. And I remember the first time him talking about it. And he is talking about this, like he's climbing this mountain and everyone in the room is just spellbound by his story. And he gets like up on, I mean, so much so he's like you're there with him and and he's standing. He finally steps on this chair and he's like, his arms are like spread out like this. And he's like, and I'm here on top of the world. And it's silence. And then he goes, and now I realize I'm only halfway there, right? This is version 1. I hear him talk 5 years later. He climbed Mount Everest again. This time, he is been married and he has 2 kids. And he's talking about the same moment. And we get to that same moment, like that same like final like moment where he is all of a sudden going like he's there. And instead, you know what he's thinking? He's going like basically like, what the fuck am I doing here? Like I have kids at home, like my wife, like what am I doing here? What a selfish pursuit. And that will always that story and just seeing like that dichotomy of the 2 tellings from the same human being, just in a different variation of their narrative and story, made me just really start to think about like the things that we do, and we just go, if I can just get to that peak, and you get to that peak, and the elated moment right before you like reach that peak, right, whatever that peak is like the happiness, and then when you finally get there, you just go, that's it. Like, I thought the heavens were going to open up. I thought, you know what I mean? Like, and like the choirs were just going to start singing and I was going to feel the bask of the sun on my face. And I think that so often we are looking for happiness, but they seem to happen in transactions. But on the other side, it's so fleeting. But like these moments of like when my second daughter was born. And so I have a gap between of about 13 years between my oldest daughter and my next daughter. And so different. Talking about Jamie Clark, 26 when I had my oldest, 39 when I have my second. They're just different human beings. And I remember picking Mia up. And it brought me back to this moment, Charlotte, that it was like, do you remember what it was like when Christmas for the first time? Like the first time you can really remember Christmas, all the traditions, the energy, the family, like the food, the smells, right? You are like there. And that's what it felt like. And I just went, this feels like joy. Man, And I think that so often in the pursuit of that external, and I like how in the beginning of our conversation you talked about the external, is like that's I feel like the external is like the transaction trap, like the happiness trap. And these internal things that I'm really curious of, that you have like spent so much time like sort of developing and pulling out like through identities and beliefs. I feel like that's like the joy transformation. I don't know. That's just how like I see it, as like transactions versus transformations.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I love that, and I think there's a lot of in that in terms of how most people chase happiness as well, right? As these like big moments, and there was something really important about what you said. The biggest joy often comes, or the biggest happiness, the biggest spurt of dopamine and excitement often comes like just before you hit it, because like you're gonna reach the top of Mount Everest, and that's like the most excited you'll be, and then you're on top, and then you realize, oh, I have to walk back down. Right, like sort of, or you enjoy it for long enough before recently saw a video of like people queuing up to get up Mount Everest. Hey, like it looks quite insane these days, but that's beside the point. So I think the difference I hear, or how I think about this, maybe to just, this is why I wanted to clarify joy and happiness. I think what you call joy, I think of or refer to as fulfillment, and I'll tell you how I think they're different. I think happiness is these like fleeting bursts. And you're right that many people like have a transactional relationship with happiness, in the sense that once I reach X, Y, and Z, I'll be happy, right? Sort of like they still believe very much in this hedonic treadmill of like, this thing is going to change me, where really all it does is it gives me a moment of happiness. Fulfillment to me is a lot more like um, a baseline in the background. So if I look at, and maybe this is more what you mean with the transformational joy, like I feel different on a consistent basis, but it's not like I'm consistently riding this high of like ultimate happiness like the first time I was on Everest, right? It's more like a general sense, a general consensus where like most of the days, or by and large, I feel at this higher level of, you referred earlier to energy, right? That's what I determine as fulfillment. And the way I think about it, the way positive psychology thinks about it, is values alignment. So what just happened in that example that you gave is actually a really beautiful example of that, right? Both of your personal ones as well as the Everest ones. I'll go with the Everest one, because in the first example, that was like, he had nothing, that was his value, was adventure probably, or like achievement, or whatever it is, was one of his top values, was just whatever that facilitated for him. Then he had a change in values, but he didn't adjust his goals accordingly. But his values actually changed to, let's say, family being one more important, or whatever it was that you kind of mentioned he wanted to get back to his kids. Like, what am I doing? It was related to family, right? So there was a shift in values. And I kept playing the same game, but I actually have changed my ingredients. So if we're talking about ingredients, right, as much as we all simple creatures, and we probably all have very similar ingredients, like overall, if we're talking just like simple, like safety, connection, security, like right, base ingredients, but values are kind of your personal flavor of that. Like, where, take this example, if I say my top value at any point in my life might have been adventure, right? And then going Mount Everest might be one of the coolest things I could do, because it's peak adventure. And maybe my second value was like, yeah, achievement, like physical achievement, pushing myself or something like that. That's going to be the pinnacle of my experience and very aligned with those values. As soon as my values change because of life circumstances, because of life events, because I just age and I have more experiences, and I like silently change, but I do the same thing, it's not going to hit the same way because it's not aligned. And so it's this interesting, I think, pursuit and question, and also awareness that like your values will change over time. And that those are your ingredients for what you call joy, what I call fulfillment. Like, I, if I lived the exact same way I lived 5 years ago right now, I probably wouldn't be happy with that, but I was back then. Right. And then I changed, and then my life changed, and my circumstances changed. And I need to make sure I'm in assessment with myself of like, well, what is it that I'm optimizing for right now? Because I can't optimize for everything. And I need to give myself that internal measure. And that's what will create the fulfillment, the baseline of like, I feel like most days I'm pretty content. I'm pretty happy.
Just locked in something to me. One of my favorite books, I think it's actually on my bookshelf back here, is a book called Salt, Fat, Acid, and Heat.
Oh gosh, we have that here as well.
It's like, but it's like what you need to actually like to cook. And what I just took from you in this like an analogy of like we have these ingredients, right? And but is the core your values is your cooking method, right? I mean, that's what I took from there, and it's the alignment. Like, you know, if your heat is off, right, your acid is off, your salt, you know, like what you're cooking is not going to land like, oh, I want to recreate that right from like 5 years ago, and that is absolutely fascinating. So I'm really curious, and I like how you said it's your personal flavor and the combination of your ingredients, the season you're in, right, which might be where your feet are at in life, your values and how you cook. And I liked how you put this into alignment and not alignment, or unalignment. And I'm really curious because how this plays into this conversation, but I'm really curious your thoughts on striving versus ambition. I think the thing that I'm really curious of, and I think that I'm noticing is that we're either running from or running to. We are either pushing for or being pulled by, right? Like these forces, these energies. And I think that, and when I came to the conclusion this last week, that striving is actually running from and having to push towards. So, like when you think about energy, pushing is a lot harder than being pulled by, versus ambition is running to or towards, right? So again, by instead of from fear and actually excitement, in that you're being pulled towards. How does that balance? Because I want to go back to the comment you made earlier. You said there's a spectrum, right? And then there's this happy medium. Like it's not languishing, but it's not like you're just like, I got to go for gold every single time. How do you view that in this idea of finding this fulfillment? By the way, I love your assignment to fulfillment, because you know when you're fulfilled, and that is a moment where you can savor it.
I was just going to say, or it's a string of moments over time, right? I think that's important because fulfillment can exist beyond just a single moment. And I think that's a key differentiator to happiness, or the way that we have thought about happiness as a society, as a whatever general culture, in terms of it being tied to something, the transactional piece that you were referring to. Um, I think it's really interesting what you're saying about striving and ambition, and I would lean to agree with that. And probably the way I would conceptualize it is going back to one being maybe more extrinsically driven, right? Striving but inherently assumes that there's something for me to gain, as in I strive for something, right? And there's a reward at the end, so it's extrinsically driven. Whereas ambition is more like an inner call, perhaps, or a drive, yeah, like you were saying, a pull towards something. Where I feel like the best ambition is often a lot more around the type of person I want to be, or the type of impact I want to make in the world, than it is about that looking a specific way. So, I think is a difference between the push and the pull. Like the pull, if this is something that is intrinsically aligned and you are like driven by the idea of being a specific kind of person, that could be like, I'm, ambitious about being the kindest person anybody interacts with today, right? It doesn't have to be, but I could be ambitious about that. That means I'm going to probably approach any conversation with the waiter differently. I'm going to, I don't know, stop to chat to people in the queue or something like that, right? I could be driven by that ambition, but I can never fulfill it, which is where we tie it back to values, where I think when we look at striving or the pushing and the extrinsic measures, the happiness trap, it is tied to something that can be accomplished and achieved. This is also the difference between goals and values, by the way. Whereas a value can never be achieved in its very nature. Like if I said that I'm going to go with kindness because that was my example. If I say kindness is my top value, I'm never going to wake up one day and be like, okay, done. I'm the kindest person that ever existed. My work here is done. All I can do every single day, right, is do my best to show up in pursuit of that. And that's kind of the ambition piece. And now, like ambition traditionally probably doesn't, most people don't think about kindness when they think about ambition, although I think that's a really great thing to be ambitious about. But whatever the value structure is, right, that is what you should be ambitious about. I have this concept that I call it selective ambition, which is like kind of the process of like, rather than just being ambitious by society's rules or by like the standards you're supposed to meet, by that extrinsic piece that we kind of discussed, being like, well, no, you want to be ambitious, but you want to be selective about that ambition, and the selectivity comes from your values. So it's essentially that whole process of evaluating the rules and the conditioning and all these things, right? And being like, but ambition is great. Being pulled towards something is great. Facing discomfort is great. Being in pursuit of something, being in the process of something, right? Developing yourself is innate. We all want this. It makes us happy, right? As in fulfilled happy, not happy like one stint happy. So that's generally a great idea, to be ambitious. But what are you being ambitious about? And that's the selective piece. And I think that the most valuable things you can be ambitious about are about pursuits, which is what I mean by values, versus I want to have whatever, the biggest platform or the most income or the what. That's going to feel empty. I guarantee it there. Because unless it's tied to whatever the value behind that could be, which I can't think of one.
I like your language. I think the ambition is expanding from here. So like from self, right? Which is, you're talking about like the values, and that striving is not being here, but trying to be there. And that there's a subtle gap because you're not here because you're trying to just be there. That's what, like, the imagery that comes into my head. But Shai, I love you're clarifying something for me. This idea that values is actually the underlying sort of source code. And I'm curious in terms of are values inherently to be kind? It's not, I mean, sure, you can be kind to yourself, which is probably like practice what you preach, right? If you're going to be kind to others, you should probably be kind to yourself first, right? If you're going to be generous, you should probably be generous to yourself first, right? But I'm curious, do you find that values, when you went back to that original question, what do you want, is actually probably where we need to get down to in that simplicity? What do you want your values to be? Is like the genesis, the birthplace, the OBGYN, birthing center for like this fulfilled life.
I do think that values are the birthing center for that, quite honestly, for multiple reasons. A, because they keep you anchored in the pursuit. Like I said, they can never be achieved. B, because they are concrete but flexible enough, meaning we have an understanding that they can change over time. And even if that's just a reshuffling. And C, because they allow for that selection. And especially in today's world, you're going to have to be selective, whether you're an entrepreneur or not. Like, you literally cannot go, like, there's people who are like trying to run marathons and, also like everything at once. And so you need to be more selective about that. And I think that values are a really powerful way to distill those decisions. Because once you have clarity on that, it is like, I think it's a bit of a personal development cliche to like call it your inner compass, but it is that, where it's like it gives you a framework to measure against and measure by and use as fuel for what you want to pursue, but also use as very clear distinctions as to what you'll say no to and what you won't invest so much time in. The problem with values is that most people go, yeah, sure, I want to be kind and I want to be generous and I want to be all those things, and they kind of give you honestly often it'd be interesting to like do a correlation between, I almost want to say, the 10 commandments and what most people say as values, or like what you're supposed to be as a good person in the world kind of thing. So it takes a bit of digging to get to, not just the first answer. Again, it always takes digging to get to the real answer, but to give permission to, it's also okay if you don't, like, you can still be a kind person and that not be one of your core 5 values. Like, it's not like we're going to be like lock in on these 5 and then you can't be anything else. It's more like, what do you use as like, what do you wake up to think about, let's say, or what do you use as when you have to make a trade-off somewhere, whether, for example, again, right, like, do I hike Mount Everest or do I spend the time with my family? If you have clarity on your values, it's a very simple decision to make. And so it's not about saying no to anything else that isn't that, but it's about gaining clarity around what is most central. And then I also need to define that, and I need to prioritize that. Because, for example, if I tell you the value, what did we have earlier? Adventure, I think. That might mean completely different things to you and I and the next person. So unless I like take the time and I sit down and like, what does that mean to me and why is it important to me? When do I feel that? When do I feel? Because I could say adventure can be a way I approach my commute to work. I could like bring that into my commute to work, right? I could go outside of my house and be like, every single day I'm going to take a slightly different path. And it's because I value adventure and not because I want to bring adventure into my day. And that could be a way to live that value in like the most routine setting, right? But it could also be that adventure is, I don't know, more about the maybe extreme sports or, paragliding or whatever it is. And then it's a very different story.
How does someone actually identify their values? I mean, like how do they explore that? Like, I liked your initial question. What is it that you want? Right? Like, you're like simple, but what are the questions that someone goes, right, to avoid the lipstick on the pig? Well, I want kindness. I want to be generous, right? Like, these are all the things that I think are lip service that we think are maybe external. Maybe it's the striving of values. Like, we strive to be this rather than just like the ambition of like being. How do we get through the bullshit so we go this one without avoiding the shame or judgment spiral? Well, I probably should be this, right? Because you've heard people, well, I probably should be this. And you're like, okay, there's zero belief in that. So what are the questions we need to ask ourselves to like excavate down?
Yeah, I love that. I think the important part about that is let it be a process. So don't expect to sit down and be like, okay, what are my values? Here's my perfect list of 5. It's not going to be like that. Like, let it be a process. And I would also recommend you get someone to excavate it with you, because there's nothing like what an external perspective can do for you as you speak about your stories and you speak about your insights. And I think that's something that's severely underrated in that field. Um, I think multiple things. Like, first of all, again, let it be a process, let it be multiple questions. But the top questions I think are interesting to look at are, number one, confront yourself with death, meaning really, really, really vividly imagine your life is ending and you have an opportunity to listen in on your funeral and you've had a well-lived life and you lived out whatever, everything. What are the top 3 things people are saying about you? He was the kind of person who what? She was the kind of person who what? How do your friends remember you? How does your family remember you? What are people saying? What is the impact that you left? And a lot of people will say like, oh, he was kind, but again, it will show like very few people will say he was the most successful business person. He made so much money. So that's often the first insight is like, oh, wait, it's not about that. So it's a good level into like the layer deeper that we discussed earlier, right? It's like, it's going to move them from the external into something a little deeper. And the confrontation with death, right? I mean, we were talking about this briefly earlier on as well, where it's like, there's a gift in the confrontation with death, because like, there's a saying that is death is life's greatest gift, which I think is super profound and just surreal to think about. But I can see so much truth in that, right? The problem is just that we live our everyday lives never thinking about the fact that it will end, and that we don't know when, but eventually time will run its course in this here life. And so playing that forward and confronting yourself with that and being like, well, if I had to watch that moment now, like, what would I want them to stand for and how much am I in alignment with that? So that's one revealing question. The next revealing question, I think, is actually to look at what drives you crazy, what drives you insane, what do you really hate when people do it, what like makes you really angry, what makes you really upset, is a really great indicator that there's a conflict. It's not so much the rosy, oh, like, what do I like, what do I want to stand for, but you can tell a lot from where you come up against. You can tell a lot from what makes you really angry. And so, for example, if I get really, really upset, like, maybe we could argue if that's like appropriate or not. Let's say I get really, really upset at somebody being late to something. Then I probably value reliability, or I value even punctuality, or whatever it is. And whether that ends up being one of my top 5 doesn't matter, but we're more like on a treasure hunt to be like, what comes out as we sift through your takes on things. And only then do you go into a phase where you're like, okay, now, like, amongst those, which ones do I deem most important and which ones do I want to prioritize? But first, we've got to go on the treasure hunt and see what's there. And so that will draw something out. And then the last thing I think is an interesting question to ask is, who would you trade places with? And so another way to ask that is, who do you envy in a way? But I think envy is it's actually a really great indicator, but it has a negative connotation to it. But more like, if you had to pick 3 people that you know, or that you feel like you know enough about to like actually know what their daily life might look like. So don't go to me and say, I want to trade places with Taylor Swift or whoever. Like it's not about like stardom or anything like that, but it's like somewhere where you know enough about their, or you can imagine enough about their everyday life to be like, I would trade places with those guys for even just a day. And then it becomes interesting. Like, well, why? What do they have in their life that, you know, you think would be interesting to explore, to know more about, whatever it is. And again, treasures come up. And at the end of that, like even with just those three questions, you usually have a list. And that's more than five. And then the question becomes, what are the patterns? What are the overlaps? How do I distill this down into a workable number, and what are priorities?
This is brilliant, by the way, is that you're actually creating a call to who you've been, to who do you want to be, and to whom do you want to become, all within your core values. And so your values are this combination of that energy, past, present, and future, and that you're combining together so that you are anchoring back to the things that you always want to be because you've already been, and you are building new sort of neuron, like, you know, connections of who you want to become. Like, that's brilliant.
That's so interesting. I never thought about it as past, present, future, but I can see how, yeah, I can see how it's even the way I just approached it there is the tie in that. And it is true. It's much more stable than any goal will be. And also we need to recognize that they can shift. And often what we'll see is that they'll never, you will, it's very rare for somebody to go like a 180, like on their values, but it's more like a reshuffling. So go back to the adventure guy. He probably still loves adventure. He wouldn't have gone back to Mount Everest if he didn't still love adventure. But there was a reshuffling where now family is top priority. And because it took so much time away, or so much effort away, so much money away, whatever it is from family, that's when the conflict happened. And he stood there and he was like, what did I just do? Because it wasn't in alignment anymore.
Can you talk about the importance of identities? Because when you and I were talking beforehand in the green room, and just when we had sent out kind of our pre sort of, hey, like what fulfills you in talking about, you had talked about identities and beliefs. And I think that this is one of the things that very few people talk about, is who you are. We just go, well, my name's Ben, you're Charlotte. And that is like the lip service that we give. But that is like, that's about like the one, to put it in metric terms, that's 1 millimeter, right? It like depth of awareness. But that's like the awareness that we literally go, oh, or, you know, Charlotte is just an entrepreneurial coach, you know, like, well, that's just, again, that's the 1 millimeter, right? That makes up a tiny portion of your eggshell of like, you know, of your like yolk of like who you are. And I'm curious, why did you start like kind of like glom onto that and kind of identify that identities are so important, and what makes them so powerful, especially in this whole context we're talking about your values and down to like what you want, right? I mean, it almost seems like we need to ask for whom, right? Not for whom externally, but for whom internally, right? Can you talk to that, please?
Absolutely. I just want to make a comment of all the food metaphors you're giving me with the yolk now too. I love it. So I actually think they have two stances on this, because I think there's almost like a spiritual discussion to have, like, who am I? Like, what is the identity? And also, and we can totally go there. The first conversation I want to have about that is actually a, I think most people actually have too big of an identity. I'll tell you what I mean. And there's something I want to say, it was Naval Ravikant or somebody else. It's a very profound impact when I first heard it. It was talking about keeping your identity as small as possible. And I've been striving for that ever since, because what happens when we identify with something is we become rigid about it. And I'll dive into it in a moment, but we think about, right? Think about if I ask you, who are you? And yes, sure, you're Ben and I'm Charlotte, and we can argue, really, those are just our names. It's not who I am. There's plenty of other Charlottes out there, right? But also, most people do is like, I am my job, right? Like, I am a psychologist. Actually, I'm not a psychologist. It's what I do. I'm not those things. Those are just little titles. And you were mentioning earlier, right, with the college example of like little titles I acquire, little certificates that tell me who I am. And a lot of us acquire those and like we very much identify with them. Like we do base those as our identity. Now, the problem with identities is that they almost set like a, a temperature gauge for what else happens in terms of what you even notice, what you pursue, what you literally see and do in your life because they act as filters. So that could be in the good and the negative. Like, for example, if I consistently tell myself and I identify as a procrastinator, like I am a procrastinator, I have already decided that that is what I will do. It's who I am. It's not a personality trait. You can't be that as an identity. It's just something you do often or not. But if you remain in the behavior of it, you have more agency to change it. Whereas the identity piece kind of brings us rigidity with it and the way our brains work with, again, simplicities and the way we have to filter the world because we can't possibly absorb all of the information that exists at any given time, is they almost like act as instruction manuals of like, okay, well, this fits. And so I will filter for anything that confirms. And so that's right, confirmation bias in its finest, where the example we often give is like, if you think about a red car or you're looking to buy a red car, all of a sudden you see that same red car everywhere. It's not that all of a sudden there's more of that car, you're just noticing it more. And so if you think about your reticular activating system, so that's the part of the brain. And so that it really depends on, are you describing on a biological basis, or are you using the part of the brain, or are you just saying the phenomenon, which is confirmation bias, is the phenomenon where we tend to perceive, as in really see, but also seek out more information that confirms our existing beliefs. And I think an identity is really nothing but a really solidified and rigid belief, right? If I am something, then that's solidified and I like a strong belief. And beyond, again, biological terms, a lot of them are like I've taken them on as an identity where it's not actually an identity. So going back to that initial thought of like keep your identity as small as possible, it's really this idea of like make your rigidity around who you are and who you're allowed to be as small as possible so that you don't exclude yourself from certain things or you perceive the world in a certain way that will just confirm that. And it's a really interesting thing to notice once you kind of start leading, like, yeah, when I ask myself that question, who am I? How many labels you kind of come up with, and how, again, you also see this play out at like, you could see this play out in politics, you can see this play out in religion, where people adopt identities. And what it does is it makes them rigid against the other side. But like that in it, it all it does is it's like you filter what confirms that, and the other side filters what confirms theirs. And all of a sudden you think that person could not be more wrong and I could not be more right. And like, it's rigid. It doesn't serve you. And so we do this on so many levels. And most people are not even aware of what they have at this level, right? And that can be something, we go back to the perfectionist high achiever, somebody who's like, I am, a really successful entrepreneur, and whatever, they will do whatever they can to make the reality so. And so if in their mind, in their conceptualization of a successful entrepreneur, it doesn't match that person is home at 3 p.m. with their kids, they're not going to do that, even if that maybe is what they really want. And so it's just a really interesting, maybe the second big question that people can take from what do I want was the first one we explored, is the second one is who am I? And to see like how far down can I bring my answer to that? Because like I've now made it a point where when somebody asks me who are you, I'd like to say I'm a work in progress. And I work in psychology and I work with these kind of people and I do these kind of things. But really that's the best way I've been able to fiddle it down to something that I can stand behind, is like, because I'm constantly evolving, I'm constantly in progress, and that's a great thing. It allows me to see things, to progress in that way. Yeah, and then there's a whole other spiritual component of like, what is your being and what is your consciousness? And
Well, let's go down that line, because it almost seems like who am I is about maybe half or one third of that question, and who do I want to be is kind of like in your sort of values conversation, who do I want to become? And I'm curious from your own, because obviously you've lived like this incredible, like I was you know, being somewhat whimsical in the beginning, talking about the world's most interesting woman. But you obviously went on this journey to break through the barriers of that Swiss functionality, right? That Swiss like reliability. And I'm curious, in your own in like retroflection, I think that's a word. I'm going with it. Is that um, when someone would have said to you 5 years or 10 years ago or 15 years ago, like, who are you? What would you have said? And I'm curious, just so we can have an understanding of like how you would have answered then to how you answer today in trying to make that small footprint. Because when I think about like, I'm a father, I'm a friend, I'm a peer, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a coach, like you have all these different things. What I'm hearing you saying is like, yes, all those things can be true, but that is not necessarily your identity. Those are just maybe transactional labels of who your identity is actually being in that moment. I don't know. I'm just curious. So can you kind of walk through like in your example and in your own journey, right? Because you aren't saying do as I'm saying, you're like do as I've done. That's what my guess is.
I mean, yes and no. I think there is an important nuance here, which is like, for example, the labels you just gave, a lot of those aren't harming you in any way. Like, you know, so it's not that like you saying you being a father is actually also factual, right? Like that's there are fact, like I said, there's certain that just factual things. But I think it's more so when I talk about identity, it's more so looking at the ways it's harmful and restrictive. So the example of I am a procrastinator, you are um reinforcing that story through your actions, and then it just becomes more and more harder to break. And so it's less about like strip all your factual identities. It's strip the ones that maybe limit you. And so, for example, I'll give you an example with mine where I am a psychologist, which is definitely something I would have said, when I first finished my degree and finally got to call myself that. Um, you know, um, but I think in many ways, what I found now, and that's probably also because of the way my career has evolved and my life has evolved, I find that limiting in many ways, for myself, because it makes me feel like I need to uphold a certain sense of uh, rigidity and sort of like above scientific ground. And I need to have a theory, a psychological theory to, underlie that and all these things. But also from the outside perspective where people go like, they make that mean something. And this is what I explained to you at the start. In most cases, they make it mean that I work with mental health and I work in clinical settings and all these things. And it's like, well, no, that's actually limiting to me. That's not who I am, as in it restricts me because I feel less free to talk about the things I want to talk about and the way I want to talk about them. And B, it restricts me from the outside because they make it mean a certain thing that's not true. And this is the thing with anything, right? Like, even if I say I am a lawyer, somebody might make that mean one thing and the other person might make it mean another. It's more like, do I find it restrictive? That's the important thing. Um, I think to think a bit more about how was this different 10 years ago versus now. And, you kind of said I set out to disrupt the Swiss rigidity, I suppose, in that way, which again, like, I think it's much more a journey in hindsight than it was in foresight, as in I didn't set out to do that. It's just what happened when I was so immersed in many cultures that are very, very different, where you can immediately tell that the identity that is, like, say, the default identity that you're given. The default identity that you're given as a Swiss person is like, you are a super efficient, smart, like, driven, I don't know, functioning person. Like that is like the default, let's say that. And for example, in Vanuatu, which is the South Pacific island you mentioned, the default, I want to say, identity that you are quote unquote supposed to take on is very different. It's like, I'm caring, I'm loving, my family is the most important thing. Like, I enjoy the present. I like it's just different. And I know that I'm not speaking in I am, but the contrast was so stark that all of a sudden you're like, I mean, what do I subscribe to? Who am I? And so I think that's where the stripping away began. It was less of I now consciously am deciding that I'm not, a psychologist anymore. But like more opening the question of how am I defining myself and what I'm supposed to, be, strive for, want, where we lead into the values as well. And how else could I do that? And what parts of that do I keep and what parts do I leave? Like, I'm very much still like happily voluntarily subscribe to a lot of Swiss things. Like I also like I still strive for and value, like I don't want to waste anybody's time. Like I strive for punctuality and I like it. But those are good things. I've kind of taken them through the assessment of like, is that something I want for myself? Is that like non-restrictive, right? So it's even, you know, like you can hear the lines blur between like identity versus values, and this is all in the intangible things, right? It's not like it's like, okay, let's fix your identity first, and then we can do this, and then we can do this. That's not really how it works. It's more like, what's this? How's this all playing together? What's this cycle that it creates, and is it a cycle that serves you? If not, let's see what we can address.
Going back to this food analogy, it almost seems like your identity is actually the recipe card itself. Like where it's like I'm thinking about like, hey, you had Swiss upbringing, but then you went and actually learned to cook in a different kitchen. It was on this different island, right? And all of a sudden you're like, you know, like in French, they love their butter, right? You know, versus then you go to, you know, maybe someplace like Denmark, which is maybe about like the freshness and like the closeness to the ingredients that you're pulling in there, right? You're like, oh, okay, wow, that's kind of neat. And then you go to, you know, Italy, right, where it's like, by the way, I have a love affair with tomatoes from Italy, like just some oregano, olive oil, I mean, and some salt. Man, there's something there. But it seems like that's the recipe card because this is who you are going to be and become in all of these sort of factual things as a father, right? Of like as these factual things as an entrepreneur, as yeah, in your case, psychologist, right? Like it's like what's the plate and the flavor and the umami and that's showing up. Is that fair?
I think that's true. And I guess what happens then if I use the like my default recipe card is like I love butter and everything has to come with butter, otherwise it doesn't taste good, right? That might be restrictive. If I then open up to the idea that like, well, actually, if instead of butter I use X, Y, and Z from the Danish recipe card or this from that recipe card, that enhances my original recipe card. That's the kind of thing I'm looking for, right? And that's the difference that I mean with restrictive versus non-restrictive, where it's a very different thing to say, I choose what goes on this recipe card because I've tried different things and I've seen beyond the butter realm. And I still choose butter as one of the main ingredients because I really believe fully in the power of butter versus, no, it has to be butter because, you know, it has to be butter. And that's how I've raised. And that's what I've always believed. And who have I always been? I've always been the person that uses butter. That's restrictive. And it's going to limit what you see, how you develop, what you can grow into. And so that's much more the piece around like stripping away the identity.
Yeah. I'm curious going back to this spirituality and identity because I truly believe we as humans try to make things make sense by giving them labels and by going to try to quantify it and, you know, like here's what it is and here's the parameters. But like energy doesn't really have parameters. Energy is just energy, right? And energy can be transformed, molded, shaped, like created, multiplied, become exponential, just with simple decisions. And I think decisions are based off of like how you believe. And in a second, you can change that belief. Belief is just a stored energy, right? When you were talking about the how you'd want to be described upon death, the thing that immediately popped into my head, and I'm curious for how you would answer this. If I had to put it into an energy that like to quantify it in like a human, I think that I would want to be recognized as he was a sunrise. And I don't know, because have you ever not seen like a sunrise that just made you excited and hopeful for the day? You know, even the day that Benny died, we had this incredible, there was not a cloud in the sky sunrise. And like it was conceivably, when you look back through history, like your own history, also probably the hardest day of my life. But it was also like the most beautiful. I was hopeful for the day. And I'm curious I'm curious, what would you say like for you? Like what's your spirit experience that like when you would say that you would be, but how does that all play into the spirituality and identity and this sort of evergreen recipe card?
I mean, I think that it's the thing that we can never fully grasp, that like I almost want to say it's the kitchen in the sense of, right, like if we're trying to, it's like it's where everything is built, but we don't, contrary to a kitchen, we don't understand how it really works. We can only like try our best to make sense of it, right? Like, but it's the basis for everything. I think that, we can argue very well without energy and without consciousness, without whatever we want to call this, none of the other things could exist in the first place. I love that with that question like you went to a visual essentially, but that like immediately is so tied to a feeling, right? Whether for you or other people. I think most people have positive associations with sunrises, but maybe some people don't because they're early or whatever, right? I don't know.
Night owls, they're more appreciative of a sunset. I get it.
Exactly, right? And but it's this warmth and hopefulness, as you called it, and like I almost want to say on the cusp of something, like the day is coming, right? That evokes for you. If I'm gonna go into like the energy, I always think of just like a ball of light. And there's these meditation, it's probably inspired by those originally, these meditation techniques as well, where you start with a ball of light at your center and it just keeps expanding, 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 and eventually expands outside of you, and then eventually expands to the ones you love and beyond and beyond and beyond. And then eventually, like, this is a visualization. It expands all the way. Like you see the ball of light expand from, like, if you're imagining yourself in space. Does that make sense? Like, I feel like you're looking confused, but like, that's kind of how I imagine it, because what it reminds me of as well, what I love about this meditation or this picture of, um, again, energy, spirit, whatever we want to call it. What I love about that picture is that it's so much more fluid. And then, like, I really do think that this ball of light can expand, and that when your ball of light expands, it touches the next ball of light, kind of thing. And I know this is sounding like quite woo-woo in ways, I'm sure, for people. But like in this, like, if you put good energy out, you typically, the next person gets some of that energy, but then they also put better energy out, and it just expands and expands and expands. And so there's this infiniteness to it that I really like about that image. So I think that's kind of if I had to answer that question with an image, that would be my image. Like, just this like yellow, like lovely light, how we all don't love the white LED lights, but like this lovely yellow expanding ball of light. Like, that's probably what I'd be like. That's the kind of energy I want to bring or be remembered for.
Yeah. It's so interesting about your image, which I love, and I was there, and I was also going, I want to do a meditation session with you because whatever you're guiding through, I was like, I'm all in. But it's so interesting when people think about success, kind of tying this back to what we originally started talking about, success and winning. And we think about strategies and like knowing more knowledge. But where I found like my greatest leaps in growth as me, as like my who I am, and then all these external things that like I get to bring that to, is when I've expanded who I am. This idea of who I am, like that I am being, that has actually been where the biggest leaps have come. It's not through the knowledge. It's not through, in terms of, sure, does it help when you have like great reach, right? You have the ability to like know these skills and all these tactical things. But truly though, when that my ball of light has expanded, it's because it's not about me. It's actually about me becoming, I'm trying to think of the word here, like the next version of myself that is actually less about me, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
It does to me. I don't know if it makes sense to anybody else, but it does to me. One of my favorite sayings is, the point of a goal isn't to hit it, it's who you become in the process. And that's kind of encapsulates what you just said to me. It's like the expanding light, or the actual value, the what you remember and what you consider to be your expansion is not actually about the goal. It's about who you became in the process of pursuing that goal. And the beauty about that is it then also doesn't matter so much if this is, it actually sets so many people free, because if you think about it this way, you can stop looking for goals that you're like guaranteed to hit, or that you have like a really high confidence that you will hit, because the point isn't that. The point is you trying and pursuing it and hopefully hitting it. But even if you don't hit it, you've probably become somebody in the process. Besides the point, but it's a beautiful, I guess, just re-anchoring into the process of, right? So all that external stuff, it didn't do anything for you. It's the who you became that really made the changes, which leads us back to maybe ingredients of like, what are the ingredients in the pursuit that will make it feel that way in the end? And I think they are intrinsic. So this is like aligned with, what do you want? What are your values, right? Like, it's a you thing. But they're also, I want to say, in service to, and that could be in service to your closest loved one, or it could be in service to all of humanity if you have a really big goal. I think that makes it very different from the standard goal that you might pursue, like more money, more income, more status, whatever it is, because often they do neither.
I love that we both had this common sort of anchoring back to food and ingredients, because the food is what really sustains us, right? And in so many different ways, from a nutritional standpoint, from a delight standpoint, from a fulfillment standpoint, from like just so many different things. Yeah. One of the things that I noticed in preparing for our conversation today is that so many people are all about more, but you have this kind of counter sort of look at, it's not about having more ingredients. It's actually potentially about having less. And you have this idea that I wrote down about intentional constraints. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that I liken it to, say, the word excavate. I always tell people, stop trying to be there, because the perfect version of you already exists. It's just layered under a bunch of bullshit. Right? That's my very American way of saying that. But can you talk? Can you talk about this idea of intentional constraint? Because I think that is like, and this is where you're pulling from that. I think that Swiss like recipe card, right? Of like that sort of influence, right? But can you talk about that?
Absolutely. First of all, I just want to reference, I think I wanted to say this earlier, and I think it's important to point out that the unhappiness is always created in wishing yourself away from what is happening right now, right? This is what you were saying now. The perfect version of you already exists. It's just layered. And what we were saying earlier with like the difference between happiness versus joy, where the unhappiness arises because you're wishing yourself away from now versus being where your feet are, and also having the ambition to like do something else, or again, it doesn't always have to be more, but like sort of living in that divide versus right here is it good enough. Thus, once I reach X, Y, Z, I will be happy, or I will be perfect, or whatever it is. That's just the thought I had that I wanted to say earlier as well. Intentional constraint, I think, is actually just a lot more, so a lot less related to the perfect version of you or stripping away in terms of rules or anything like that. I think I actually think about that much more in the design of everyday life, meaning you live in a world of complete abundance. And in this world, in any world, I think, but in this world specifically, where you're constantly being pulled and tugged at from anything from, you could eat 5 million things because the grocery store aisles are so overwhelming, or from, your phone constantly pings you, or whatever it is. I think that constraint is actually like intentional constraint, creating intentional boundaries around what you will and will not do, and based on your values. So this is where we tie back, is a superpower, because the superpower arises from saying no, not from, oh great, all these things are happening for me. So that's how I view that as a general rule. And then I think in your everyday life as well, we can very much argue that we have all this I would imagine it's the same in sort of your realm of, I don't know, social media, whatever it is, where it's, this constant overconsumption. So intentional constraint in terms also of like, maybe don't have the treat every day. Maybe don't, I don't know, do whatever the fun thing is every single day, and not in a way of like harming yourself, but in a way of actually increasing the experience when it happens. So the easiest example is food. We'll go back to food, right? If you eat those tomatoes that you just told me about, if you ate those every single day, actually, food is a great example because I think we all have these. I know a lot of people who cycle through these, like, this is my favorite breakfast or whatever it is, and they eat it every single day. And then eventually it just like, oh, I cannot eat that anymore. Like, I've had too much of it. And they also actually ruin a really good thing. Or we do it with songs too, where we listen to the song so often that we kind of ruin it for ourselves. So I think there's intentional constraint around those things too, where you like constrain yourself in the doses of the good things because it makes the good things better. And that doesn't mean that the other things in between can't also be good. It just means don't like go so hard on the tomatoes so that you won't like tomatoes next month anymore.
It just goes back to this idea of there's this pendulum, right? Perfectionism and like whatever this is, that messy middle is this, it's like this sweet spot that we land into. I think about when I've done like a 5-day fast. Like day 1, hard. Day 2, 3, part of 4, I'm in like this euphoria of like freedom. Day 5, I'm going, man, I'm ready to kill a steak right now. But it almost feels like that this pendulum is that I love how you call out the fact that we are in the greatest abundance time period ever in the history of ever. Yet when you look at mental health, you look at happiness factors, we're probably in the least happy, abundant feeling time ever. I personally don't feel that. But when you look at kind of social media, you look at polling, you look at political strife, and I think it goes back to, you talked about these identities and people like getting that rigidity, almost concrete rigidity. But it almost seems like if these two sides actually did an intentional fast on whatever they're consuming in those identities and actually did an exploration, like you went from Switzerland to this remote island in South Pacific, you cannot get like no mountains, or maybe they did have mountains there, but like no mountains. Like it would be shocking if they had snow there, right? If it's like non-existent, to like Switzerland, right? Like complete opposite sides. And you consumed other ingredients and it changed your makeup forever. Like you can never go back to, it's like, what is it? Ralph Waldo Emerson, like a mind once expanded can never go back to its original shape. Um, so I find that is really interesting.
Do you know, I think that would solve a lot of problems in the world. The willingness even to try other flavors or other foods, experiences, opinions, even, right? Like we often say the problem with divides is that the two sides stop listening to each other. And you're so far and so rigid in your own belief system that you lose the ability to sit down with the other person to understand how they arrived there. I always think of, debate class. I don't know if I think that's quite common in the US too, where you are like assigned the side and you have to argue the side that is actually the other side of what you would inherently want to argue for, and it's a really difficult thing to do, but it forces you to like think about the other side, and people don't do that in any, like, they just go, that's othering, and then we go out group things, out group versus in group and all these things, right? But like where yeah, it's the rigidity, and if we could all just open up to the idea that there's other truths out there, and to really internalize the idea. I think this is also where we can go back to some brain science, that your reality at any point is just your reality. It's not actual reality, because that's how your brain works. Like you come into contact with all these bits of information, and then they enter through your senses, and then this little machine up here constructs something based on what it just saw. But the way it constructs that is intimately related to what it's already filtering out, what it's filtering for, what it wants to see more of, what it's predicting, all these things. And once you understand that your reality is only ever reality as you see it, I think you can kind of open yourself back up to the idea that there are other realities, and that can be enriching for you, right? Like in the way that it was very enriching for me to go travel or to live on the other side of the world because it changed me as a person, right? It could also be confronting, but in any sense, I think it's important for us to remember that none of us have the right idea, like the right reality. None of our brains have the capacity to actually absorb reality 100% as it is. We can't. We have to filter.
It'd be a really interesting experiment, especially in the United States, if people identify as Democrats for 30 days, only read, only consumed the ingredients that someone who identifies as a Republican, and then vice versa, someone who's a Republican for 30 days, only consumed the things that maybe Democrats would consume, the ingredients that Democrats would consume. I'm curious to see in that experiment, like, I mean, there's so many things that as people listen to, well, here's where this could go wrong. But I'm curious in this, in what you were just talking about, if that shift would happen to more, not a shift in belief, but shift in empathy, grace, and moderation.
And I think that's exactly that stance, right? That is all we don't all have to think the same things. We don't all have to agree on everything. We just need to understand that somebody can arrive at a different conclusion and it makes sense to them. And I can get curious about how it makes sense to them. And probably there's a middle ground where, like, as in, there is probably a common ground somewhere where if we strip that down to the basic needs or wants that we, again, are actually probably more similar than we think. I think it would be a really interesting experiment. And I mean, the layer that we haven't discussed in this is the fact that, not only do I have my own system, as in my brain, for filtering out information and whatever, but now I also have an algorithm that if I'm consuming, let's say, more Democratic or Republican leaning content, I will also get more of that. And I won't, it's really just this rigidity is being like 10x'd in the social media landscape or the algorithm landscape, let's say, where my brain's already doing that. I'm less inclined to look for and absorb information that doesn't confirm that. But then I also start teaching the algorithm what I'm into, and then I just see more and more and more of that. So I'm completely losing that ability to take perspective of the other side, to even ever be exposed to the other side, because they're all nuts in the head anyway. And, again, I developed this rigidity about I'm right and you're wrong. And I lose the perspective that actually none of us are right because none of us can absorb all of reality at any given time.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. How do we be and become this expanding version of this ball of light, right? As we expand from here to here to here in a world that is trying to algo you into here, 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 and here.
I will go back to intentional constraints, right? Which also means intentional constraint with your consumption. And I mean, a lot of my work is based on social media, so I'm not arguing for you. Like, I mean, I think in an ideal world, actually, a lot of us would be happier and better humans if we didn't use our phones. But or for that reason, at least, not use our phones. But if we're going to be, I want to say, maybe more realistic, and we're not going to go live off on a farm and, not talk to people anymore, then this is a part of our lives. And so then it's more like, okay, well, how am I being intentional with that? And the intentional constraint, especially with the phone, is you're always going to be drawn to pick it up, to be notified by it. Like, again, the apps are designed that way. The notifications are designed that way for your brain to instantly react, to instantly want to come across it to get the next dopamine hit or whatever. So if you're not setting intentional constraints around something like wake up and for the first hour, you're not looking at your phone. It can't be the first thing you look at. It can't be the last thing you look at. It can't be by your side all the time if you're trying to do deep work, because it will distract you whether you want to or not. And whether it's constraints around time spent on social media, whether it means you're challenging yourself to research keywords that you would never see in your algorithm every once in a while, right? Like to literally intentionally expand. But if we're thinking intentional restraint or constraint, then I think it's it's a lot about you putting yourself back into a position of agency over this thing that will just do with you what it wants. And I don't mean that to like be like it's the robots and they're taking over, but the algorithm is designed to keep you in it, and it's designed to keep you more things that you'll enjoy. So you taking agency back over that has to do with constraint, because it's not going to just solve itself. You have to set the rules and the boundaries around that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great common theme for our whole conversation today. Is all the questions you've posed cost nothing. All the thinking costs nothing. Except for I think that I think the currency that you have to have and be willing to spend is a commitment and courage towards the exploration of something that just requires time, intentionality, and longevity to be in it. And these are all things that are all agency oriented, right?
I'll offer one more currency, which I think is discomfort, because even taking the time is an uncomfortable thing for a lot of people to sit with their own thoughts and feelings, whatever, right? But I think I often see not having an answer can be really, really uncomfortable, and it pushes people in. Like I do this with, or see this with a lot of clients. Once we kind of like get to the point of like we've stripped away all these rules and all these, beliefs that they've kind of just shoulded themselves to, and then they're like, they enter this void. It's literally a void of like, as I was saying earlier with myself too, was like, who am I then? And like, what do I like? What do I believe in? What? And the answer usually doesn't come immediately, and that's really uncomfortable. It's really, really uncomfortable to be in that position where you feel like everything you used to believe in doesn't stand anymore, but you don't know what you believe in, and you don't know what you want to subscribe to, and you don't know what your values are and whatever. And so you have nothing to hold on to. You have no guardrails. It's almost like you're like a leaf in the wind a little bit. And that's really, really uncomfortable. And you kind of have to get through that phase and through that void to come out on the other side. You have to give that room to breathe. And that's really uncomfortable.
Yeah, it seems like there's a happy medium. Like, yeah, I find that in my life, get most uncomfortable when I actually start feeling comfortable, because I feel like it's a leading symptom of complacency, thinking that I've arrived. What do you see that allows people to make the jump to find, and this is going to be like an oxymoron, comfort in discomfort? Because I find that like I am not just being alive, but living when I'm putting myself in places where I just go, this kind of freaks my shit out a little bit. Like I am feeling like I might get exposed. And by the way, the person I'm most worried about exposing myself to is probably myself, in that being like that I'm not being as aware or honest. So can you talk a little bit about that?
I I think it's an unsatisfying answer for, I want to say, somebody who's maybe never had the experience, but I think the answer is in having enough evidence of the other side. Maybe the best way I can illustrate that is if you've not even gone to the gym. If you've never exercised and you start exercising, it feels terrible until you understand that you feel better for it. And that, I mean that both in the long term, as in you probably get fitter and you can do things differently in your everyday life, but also you reach the point where the exercise session, whatever itself, might still suck, but you come out at the other end, as in at the very immediate end of that session, feeling so good, and you've got endorphins running, whatever, that you're like, that you start to associate that situation much more than the immediate discomfort. So it's a shift between the short term and the long term, I think. And unfortunately, I do think that the only way you can really internalize that is by experiencing it. So having gone through the immediate discomfort and arrived somewhere else where you're like, whoa, that was really scary, but whoa, that was really cool. Like that was so much cooler than the scary was scary. Or with the gym example, that really sucked, but I feel really, really great now, and I feel greater now than that actually sucked. But the only way to get there is to go. The only way I can have that experience and gather that evidence is by doing it, which is the unfortunate thing if I've never practiced doing it.
That's interesting because it is the practice. It is I mean, you never, I've never had a workout where I got done and go, man, I wish I would have done that. It's usually like you feel not only endorphins, but you feel a sense of pride, accomplishment. And the accomplishment isn't necessarily you did it. The fact is that you actually just took that first initial step. I always think about this every time I do cold tub. If you've ever done cold tub, you feel number one, you feel amazing when you get done. But man, that first, especially when you do it at like 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, it's the first thing that you're doing. It's the last thing you want to do. I mean, it is the last thing that you want to do. And your brain's going, are you serious? You want to do this? And you're like, yeah, we're doing this. And they're like, no, are you serious? Um, and I think that's what the cold tub has probably brought the biggest practice in for me is being being comfortable with decisions that your body tells you are not in your best interest, which is just not true, right?
It is also just the habit that you're forming there, right? It's the habit of like my brain is saying no, and I still get to, this is again agency piece, and I still get to choose otherwise, and I still get to do otherwise, and then I get a positive reward. Like if we're thinking about habit cycle, one of the most powerful things you can find yourself in is that, because then you're not dictated by the fear or the, comfort seeking mechanism that your brain will always be to make that decision for you. And instead you're like, no, I'm in charge here. That's kind of what you're reaffirming every time you do that.
That's a beautiful thing. Isn't that weird though? We have to tell our brain, hey, just to be clear here, I'm in charge, right? It's like as if there is another human being. There's like another human being that's third party that's in our brain saying, like, we have to tell ourselves that, right? Which is sort of like, it's kind of confounding when you think about that. Go, brain, just want to let you know I'm in charge.
I mean, I think so, yes. And I also actually think what sets you free from feeling like it's weird is to just understand the brain as as a tool, as a mechanism that it is. Like it's there's a brilliant I want to say she's a clinical psychologist, but maybe she's a neuroscientist. Anyway, she's on my Instagram feed. She's great. And again, this is me just being like, this is my Instagram feed. But she says the other day, is like, would you like ask your dishwasher to mow the lawn? Would you like, I don't know, ask your laundry machine to do the dishes for you? No, because you understand that this is a machine and has a certain function. And once you understand your brain as a machine with a certain function, which is to keep you alive, to keep you safe, to predict what's going to happen next so that these things are insured, it actually makes a lot of sense. Like the function of this is, well, no, why would we do something new? We don't know how that's going to work out. Let's stick with what we know because that's kept you alive so far. So as long as I keep that function in mind, it actually makes perfect sense that it would choose that. And then I, as the conscious driver, could be like, well, no, like I'm actually going to do something else. Like you're not all that, like, right. This is again where we go with the consciousness versus brain versus energy, right? But that's you then in that instance is the thing that's like, well, no, I am not this, but I'm operating this machine and I can choose where we go. But by default, this is the machine's purpose.
Yeah, which makes me think about the difference between the brain. If the brain is literally just the engine, right? It's a tool, just like, hey, it's a dishwasher. This brings into like to me to a level of like consciousness. So like what is consciousness? And is it basically the collection of all the things we've been talking about this whole podcast about like identities, values, these core ingredients, the simplicity of like what is it that I want? Who do I want to be? Who do I want to become? It is the collective sort of, and not only that, but our lived experience of like where we've walked, what we've consumed.
Do you know what? I'd actually argue that a lot of the things that we've discussed today are unconscious until we make them conscious. So I probably would say that's, in my mind, in direct contrast to that being consciousness, because most of us don't walk around knowing what we believe inherently or what we were conditioned to believe or what our identities are until we ask the question, right? I think consciousness, and again, we could go on a really long spiritual discussion here, is is kind of maybe more like what you were saying, is that third person, like in the operating center of like people who have done a really good job at illustrating this is actually the whoever made or wrote Inside Out, the movie. You're watching, but I imagine it like that, where it's like consciousness is what I'm deciding at the what's the word I'm looking for? Control, in the control room. Um, but there are many things that are not in the control room for me to consider. For example, like we were just saying, um, many of the things that we were discussing in today's podcast are not in the control room in the first place. But if I like shine a light there and I bring them in and I consult them, then I can make a decision on them. But it's this intangible thing, this intangible part of me, whether it's the light or it's the spirit or it's consciousness or it's some construction of my actual machine brain that is just like sitting there and waiting to be like, what strings can I pull, or like the puppeteer or whatever. But it's like, it's not necessarily made up of any of these things, because I think it sits on top of those things and it gets to pull those things into a certain narrative structure, whatever, depending on how intently it looks at those.
So it's almost like we need to become this subconscious adventurer.
Ooh, I like that. Like the exploration of the subconscious as an adventure. Yeah. I think
Yeah, because it's sort of like what's unknown, or like I think I heard someone say like 95% of decision making happens from the subconscious, which where we think we're actually in control, but the reality of it is our underlying programming really is actually in charge. And what I'm hearing you say, like, hey, the roadmap to success and winning as a byproduct of fulfillment is through the exploration and adventuring into these subconscious things, and kind of being like, if you're a Star Trekkie, right? Like USS Enterprise, right? Going where no person's gone before. It's really a metaphor of really like this sort of like excavating these through questions, these things that are in our subconscious. Does that make sense?
yeah, I mean that's probably separate from the discussion what is consciousness, but which again probably has its own 2-hour podcast attached to it, unless like what is consciousness. But if we're thinking about what is the pursuit of all these things that we've discussed here and what ties that together, it's definitely making unconscious things conscious and making a conscious intentional choice. Because the way it's totally true, 95% is estimates, I guess. But if we think about I always like to think about like the iceberg model, right? Like Titanic style, where it's like, if you're never stopping to ask these questions and to directly choose, what does success mean for me? When do I feel fulfilled? Who do I trade places with? All these things that we discussed. You're looking at this little tip of the iceberg, and it's shaped by what somebody else told you the iceberg should look like. So yes, if you don't make that pursuit into like, well, what is actually here? And I like travel into the unconscious and I bring it to the surface, then I can't make any decisions with it. Then it will just run me, because again, it's the same way the iceberg works. It will determine which ships crash and which ships get to pass, not based on this little tip, but based on what's underneath.
Well, Charlotte, I've loved having you on here. And again, I agree. I think there's a whole nother podcast that we need to have around this subconscious, conscious, and consciousness. And you've been amazing. If people want to know more about you, like where can they find you? If they're like, ooh, I want like I want another bite, keeping with this analogy of food, like where can they find you? I know you got some really cool things going on right now, some platform stuff, and I'd love if you shared with our audience.
Thanks. You're making me reconsider whether I should rename my platform something food focused. But the easiest place to find me is on Instagram. It's at the Mind Friend. So literally being friends with your mind. Think of that. And it's just at the Mind Friend. The other place you can find me is on Substack, where I write in a place called Selectively Ambitious, which is part of the concept that we discussed today. And that's a little more community minded. I really love subs. It's a new thing, but it's I love it for people think of it as a blogging platform, but it's actually really interactive, and people go there to interact with content versus just consume. And that's kind of why I hang out there and the kind of people I want to hang out with.
Absolutely. And again, if people want to engage you, like not just like to consume a little bit more, or to like not just engage you on Substack, where can they go? I know you have you have like I thought was a really cool course that I was like, huh, you gotta tell me a little bit more about this, but it's called the Self-Sabotage Cure. Like,
Yeah.
come on.
Yeah. Yeah. If I can be the doctor of anything, I'll be the doctor of that. But you'll find it on my Instagram as well, in my link in bio. But otherwise, you can go to my website, themindfriend.net, and then /SSC. And the course is really an excavation of the unconscious, let's say, of the subconscious cycles that drive self-sabotage. So it hits on beliefs, it hits on emotions, it hits on thoughts, and how that all translates into the actions you keep seeing every day, and sort of takes that cycle apart and thus cures the symptom of self-sabotage, let's say.
That's fantastic. And again, if you are an entrepreneur who is like listening to this going, yeah, I love the idea, I can consume, but man, I want like this one-on-one. Can they actually do that with you, Charlotte? Can they like engage you in that way?
They most certainly can. It's one of my favorite things, to work on an individual basis, and get into the real nitty-gritty of, I guess, everybody's stories and ways it transforms. Link for that will also be easiest to find. Either we link it in the show description or it'll be easy to find from Instagram.
Yep, we'll absolutely do that. Well, before we close out here, one of the things, as you know, that I like to do is I like to have our guests have the last thought, the last ripple, the last word, maybe the last question. What do you want our audience to know, or to ripple, or to ponder, or to maybe shine a light on?
The word ripple made me think of the expanding light again. And it's just a different metaphor, but I think to think of your light, not only in service to you, but also others, is a really, really wonderful thought to bring to what you do. But it has to be both. So it's your expanding light because it makes you feel warmer on the inside, and also the ripple of that. If you think about that, I think it often sets you free from a lot of problems that are far too self-centered, and they put you more into perspective of how can I expand that? And that often entails being a little more lighthearted and happier yourself.
I love that. I love that so much. Charlotte, thank you so much for being on here today. And thank you for just sharing so generously. It's been a true joy. And this has been like the fastest, like almost 2 hours. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me and for all your food metaphors. I'll take them with me.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening. A big thanks to Elation Lab for the production and creative design. Remember to like, subscribe, and follow us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Keep listening for more Max Life.